My name's Olivia Thompson, and my life had always been something out of a glossy magazine. My parents, James and Victoria Thompson, were the kind of people who could make anything happen with just a phone call. I grew up in a world of extravagant galas, private jets, and five-star vacations, but somehow, amidst all that glitter and luxury, I always felt a little out of place, like I was living someone else's life. I attended an elite private school, surrounded by the sons and daughters of CEOs, celebrities, and politicians. My friends, if you could call them that, were more concerned with their designer clothes and the latest gossip than anything real. They weren't bad people, just shallow like a perfectly decorated cake that's all icing and no substance. That's where I met him. Jack Mitchell. He was different, to say the least. While the rest of the school drove luxury cars and wore clothes that cost more than some people's monthly rent, Jack was the guy who showed up in a beat-up old truck, wearing grease-stained jeans. He wasn't a student at our school, but we'd see him around when our cars needed fixing because, God forbid, anyone at my school knew how to change a tire. Jack worked at his father's auto repair shop just a few blocks from school. He had rough hands and a smile that made my heart skip a beat every time I saw him. At first, I just watched him from a distance, curious about this guy who seemed so real. My friends didn't notice him to them. He was invisible, a nobody. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. One day, I mustered up the courage to talk to him. I told myself it was just because my car needed fixing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole story. I wanted to know more about the guy behind the grease stains. I wanted to know what it felt like to be around someone who wasn't constantly thinking about money or status. And so I did. I started spending more time at the shop, finding excuses to hang around while Jack worked on my car, even though it probably didn't need fixing. He was kind, funny, and didn't treat me like some delicate, rich girl who needed special attention. He saw me for who I was, or at least who I wanted to be. Of course, it didn't take long for my so-called friends to notice. They started making jokes behind my back, calling me Cinderella and asking if I was planning to trade in my designer heels for a wrench. It hurt, but I tried to ignore it. I knew they didn't understand, couldn't understand. How could they, when they'd never had to work a day in their lives? But it wasn't just my friends. My parents, especially my mother, started getting suspicious. She couldn't fathom why I would spend so much time at a dirty old garage when I could be doing anything else. And honestly, I didn't have a good explanation for her, not one that she would understand. All I knew was that Jack made me feel something I'd never felt before alive. But I had no idea how much more there was to Jack Mitchell, the guy everyone thought was just a mechanic from the wrong side of the tracks. The more time I spent with Jack, the more I realized how different he was from everyone else in my life. He didn't care about the things that seemed so important to everyone around me: money, status, appearances. He was passionate about his work, loved getting his hands dirty, and talked about cars with a kind of enthusiasm I'd never heard before. But it wasn't just cars. He had this way of making even the simplest things feel exciting. A drive out of town, a walk through the park, even just sitting on the hood of his truck and talking, it all felt so real, so different from the perfectly curated life I was used to. Jack was a mystery to me, though. As open as he was about his love for cars, he didn't talk much about his past or his family. Whenever I asked, he'd give me vague answers or change the subject. I figured he probably had a complicated story. Maybe his family was struggling, and he didn't want to talk about it. I respected that. I knew what it was like to have people pry into your life, so I didn't push him. But then came the day when everything changed. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Jack had invited me to go on a drive. He had just finished restoring an old classic car, a beautiful 1967 Mustang, and wanted to take it for a spin. We drove out of the city, leaving behind the noise and chaos, and ended up at a quiet spot overlooking the hills. We sat there, the wind gently rustling the trees, as the sun started to dip below the horizon. As we sat there, I could feel something hanging in the air, something unspoken. I could see it in Jack's eyes. He was wrestling with something, trying to find the right words. And then, finally, he spoke. "Olivia, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady but laced with a seriousness I hadn't heard before. "I haven't been completely honest with you, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't want to complicate things." My heart started to race. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I knew it was important. "The truth is," he continued, "I'm not just a mechanic. I mean, I am a mechanic, but it's more than that. Working at the shop, fixing cars, it's something I love doing, something I chose to do, but it's not all there is to me." He paused, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "My family, we're not what you think. My parents, they're actually, well, they're wealthy, very wealthy." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Wealthy," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded. "Yeah, my dad owns a huge manufacturing company. We're not just comfortable we're in the same circles as your parents, but I didn't want that to define me. I wanted to do something real, something that I cared about, so I decided to work at the shop. It's where I feel most like myself." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. This was the last thing I expected. Jack, the guy who I thought was just a regular mechanic, was actually from a world as wealthy as mine. It was almost too much to believe. "I wanted you to know because I care about you," Olivia, Jack said, his voice soft but sincere. "I didn't want you to think I was hiding something from you, or that I wasn't being honest about who I am. I didn't want you to feel like I was deceiving you." I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke, but all I saw was the truth. Jack wasn't lying, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The way he avoided talking about his family, his reluctance to share too much about his past. It all made sense now. "I don't care about the money, Jack," I said finally, my voice shaking slightly. "I never did. I liked you because you were different, because you made me feel alive. And that hasn't changed. If anything, knowing this just makes me respect you more. You didn't let the money define you. You chose your own path." Jack smiled then, a relieved, genuine smile that made my heart swell. "I'm glad you understand. I was worried. I don't know. That you'd see me differently, that it might change things between us." "It doesn't change anything," I assured him. "Except maybe now I'm even more curious about who you really are." Jack laughed, a warm, joyful sound that made me feel like everything was going to be okay. "Well, there's a lot more to me than just being a mechanic," he said, teasingly. "But we've got time. I'll tell you everything, I promise." As we sat there, the sun setting in the distance, I realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in our story, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take us. But little did I know, this revelation was just the first of many surprises to come. After Jack's confession, everything between us seemed to fall into place, but the world around us became more complicated. I still spent time with my old friends, but it was different now. Their jokes about Jack being a poor mechanic were no longer just annoying, they were downright irritating. They didn't know the truth, and part of me didn't want them to. But I also knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. As the weeks passed, Jack and I grew even closer. We spent more time together, and I began to see sides of him that no one else did, the thoughtful, introspective side, the side that loved talking about everything from philosophy to dreams for the future. I met his parents, who were as warm and down-to-earth as Jack had described. Despite their wealth, they welcomed me with open arms, treating me like I was already part of the family. But there was one thing that was becoming impossible to ignore: my friends' relentless curiosity. They noticed how happy I was, how much time I was spending with Jack, and it didn't take long for the rumors to start flying. They speculated about who he was, what he did, and why I was so smitten with him. The more they talked, the more annoyed I got, until one day I decided I'd had enough. It was a Friday night, and as usual, my friends were planning a night out at the most exclusive club in the city. They insisted I come along, but I knew they had an ulterior motive. They wanted to pry into my relationship with Jack. I agreed, but on one condition: I wanted Jack to come with me. When I asked him, Jack seemed hesitant at first. He wasn't a fan of the club scene, and I couldn't blame him. But I reassured him that it would be fine, that we didn't have to stay long, and eventually he agreed. That night I felt a mix of excitement and dread. I knew this would be the moment when the truth would start to unravel, when my friends would finally see Jack for who he really was. Part of me was worried about how they'd react, but another part of me was ready to show them that their assumptions were dead wrong. We arrived at the club fashionably late, as expected. The moment we walked in, all eyes were on us, on Jack, specifically. He looked incredible, dressed in a sharp suit that highlighted his strong features and confident demeanor. I could see the confusion in my friends' eyes as they struggled to reconcile the poor mechanic they'd imagined with the man standing next to me. "Olivia, you actually brought him," my friend Emily whispered as she pulled me aside, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He's not what I expected." "I told you he was different," I replied, a hint of smugness in my voice. "There's a lot you don't know." The night went on, and as expected, my friends couldn't stop themselves from probing Jack with questions. At first, they were subtle, trying to find out more about his background, but as the drinks flowed, they got bolder. Jack handled it all with grace, sidestepping their questions with ease and turning the conversation back to them. But it wasn't until one of my friends, Jessica, finally got frustrated and asked the million-dollar question that the night took a dramatic turn. "So, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "what do your parents do? I'm guessing they're not mechanics too, right?" Jack looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. He glanced at me, and I gave him a slight nod, signaling that it was okay to reveal the truth. "My parents," Jack said, his tone casual. "Well, my father owns Mitchell Industries. It's a manufacturing company. You might have heard of it." The room went silent. I could see the shock on my friends' faces as they processed what Jack had just said. Mitchell Industries was a name everyone knew. It was one of the biggest companies in the country, a giant in the manufacturing world, and it belonged to Jack's family. "Wait, you're serious?" Emily stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're that Mitchell?" Jack nodded, his expression calm. "Yeah, that's me. But I chose to work at the auto shop because it's what I love. I didn't want to just be another rich kid living off my parents' money." The silence that followed was deafening. My friends didn't know what to say, how to react. All this time they'd been looking down on Jack, assuming he was beneath them. And now they were the ones who were left speechless. "I guess this wasn't what you expected." "Ha," I said, breaking the silence, my voice tinged with satisfaction. Jessica finally found her voice. I had no idea," she admitted, her tone completely changed. "I'm sorry, Olivia. We were wrong." The rest of the night was a blur. My friends tried to recover, to make up for their previous attitudes, but the dynamic had shifted. Jack wasn't just the poor mechanic anymore. He was someone they suddenly wanted to impress, to be on good terms with. As we left the club that night, Jack and I couldn't help but laugh at how the evening had turned out. It was clear that things would never be the same with my friends. But I didn't care. I was with Jack, and that's all that mattered. But even though the truth was out, there was still one more surprise left in store, one that would completely turn the tables and leave everyone, including me, utterly speechless. After that night at the club, everything changed. My friends, who had always been so sure of themselves, were suddenly stumbling over their words, trying to figure out how to act around Jack. It was almost amusing to watch them attempt to make up for all the things they'd said before, now that they knew who Jack really was. But Jack didn't hold it against them. He was gracious, as always, though I could tell he found the whole situation just as ironic as I did. As for us, we grew closer than ever. There was something freeing about having the truth out in the open, about not having to hide who Jack really was. We spent more time together, and as the months passed, our relationship deepened in ways I never could have imagined. We talked about everything: our hopes, our fears, our dreams for the future. And the more we talked, the more I realized that Jack was the person I wanted to spend my life with. One weekend, Jack invited me to his family's estate for a formal dinner. His parents were hosting some business associates, and Jack thought it would be a good opportunity for me to see another side of his world, the one I'd only glimpsed before. I was nervous, but Jack assured me that everything would be fine. The estate was breathtaking, even more so than I remembered from my previous visits. It was the kind of place you saw in movies, with sprawling gardens, a massive fountain in the driveway, and a house that looked more like a palace than a home. As we walked through the grand entrance, I couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Despite my own upbringing, this was Jack's world, but in many ways, it still felt foreign to me. Dinner was as formal as I expected, with impeccably dressed guests and waitstaff who moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. I was seated next to Jack's mother, Elizabeth, who was as gracious and charming as ever. She made me feel at ease, asking about my family and my interests, and sharing stories from Jack's childhood that made me laugh. Despite the grandeur of the setting, there was a warmth to the evening that I hadn't anticipated. After dinner, Jack suggested we take a walk through the gardens. The night was clear, the air crisp, and the moonlight cast a soft glow over the perfectly manicured lawns. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, hand in hand, until we reached a small gazebo tucked away in a quiet corner of the garden. As we stood there, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers, Jack turned to me, his expression serious but soft. "Olivia, there's something I've been wanting to ask you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. My heart skipped a beat. I had a feeling I knew what was coming, but I didn't want to get ahead of myself. "What is it, Jack?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto mine. "These past few months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought something into my world that I didn't even know was missing. You've seen me for who I really am, beyond the wealth, beyond the pomp, the expectations, and you've loved me for it. And I know, without a doubt, that I want to spend the rest of my life with you." As he spoke, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. My breath caught in my throat as he opened it, revealing the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen, an elegant diamond set in a simple, timeless band that sparkled in the moonlight. "Olivia Thompson," Jack said, dropping to one knee, his eyes never leaving mine. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I could hardly believe what was happening. The man I loved, the man who had become my world, was asking me to be his wife. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked down at him, my heart overflowing with love and happiness. "Yes, Jack," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." The look of pure joy on Jack's face was something I'd never forget. He stood up, slipping the ring onto my finger, and pulled me into his arms. We kissed, and in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. It was just the two of us, standing in that beautiful garden, ready to begin the rest of our lives together. But as much as this moment felt like the perfect ending to our story, it was only the beginning. Little did I know, the real surprise was yet to come, the one that would leave everyone, including me, utterly astonished. After Jack proposed, everything seemed like a whirlwind of excitement and planning. The news of our engagement spread quickly through our social circles, and while most people were genuinely happy for us, I could tell that some were still trying to process the idea that the poor mechanic was, in fact, one of the wealthiest young men in the city. My parents, after the initial shock, came around and started to see Jack for who he truly was, a man of integrity, passion, and love for me. It didn't hurt that his family's wealth was on par with theirs, either. As the wedding day approached, the excitement reached a fever pitch. It was going to be the event of the year, no expense spared, no detail overlooked. My mother, always the perfectionist, took the reins of the planning, ensuring that everything was as grand as the occasion demanded. But even with all the glitz and glamour, Jack and I managed to keep our focus on what really mattered: our love for each other and the life we were about to start together. The day of the wedding arrived, and it was everything I'd ever dreamed of. The ceremony was set in a stunning cathedral, adorned with flowers and candlelight. My dress was a masterpiece, and as I walked down the aisle, I couldn't help but feel like I was floating. Jack stood at the altar, looking as handsome as ever, his eyes shining with love and pride. As I reached him, we exchanged a look that said everything. This was it, the moment we had both been waiting for. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with heartfelt vows and promises of forever. But it was the reception where the real surprise awaited. The reception was held at a luxurious estate owned by Jack's family, a place so grand it made even my parents' mansion look modest. The guests mingled, champagne flowed, and the air was filled with laughter and music. But as the evening wore on, there was a sense that something big was about to happen, something no one had expected. After dinner, as the band started to play a slow, romantic tune, Jack took my hand and led me to the center of the dance floor. The room fell silent as everyone turned to watch us, their faces filled with anticipation. Jack smiled at me, his eyes twinkling with that familiar mischievousness that I had come to love. "There's something I want to share with everyone," he announced, his voice carrying through the room. "Something that I think will surprise a few people." I looked at him, curious and slightly nervous. I had no idea what he was planning. Jack turned to face the crowd, his arm still wrapped around me. "Most of you know me as Jack Mitchell, the mechanic who fell in love with Olivia. But there's something you don't know, something even Olivia doesn't know." My heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? What could he possibly have kept from me? "You see," Jack continued, "while I've been working at my father's auto shop, I've also been working on something else, a project that's been close to my heart for a long time. And today, on this special day, I think it's time to share it with all of you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small remote control. With a press of a button, the large projection screen behind us lit up, revealing a series of images, blueprints, construction sites, and finally, a sleek, state-of-the-art building that took my breath away. "This," Jack said, his voice filled with pride, "is the Mitchell Innovation Center, a place where we'll be developing cutting-edge technology for the automotive industry. It's been my dream for years, and it's finally coming to life. And Olivia, I want you to be a part of it. I've already spoken to your father, and he's agreed to be our partner in this venture. Together, we're going to change the world." The room erupted in applause, but I was in a daze, trying to process what Jack had just revealed. Not only was he a successful businessman in his own right, but he had also been planning this massive project behind the scenes, all while letting me believe he was just a simple mechanic. "Jack, I don't know what to say," I whispered, my eyes filling with tears. "This is incredible." Jack smiled, pulling me closer. "I wanted to prove that I was more than just my family's money, that I could build something on my own, with my own two hands. And I want you by my side, Olivia, not just as my wife, but as my partner in everything." I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "Of course, Jack. I'm with you, always." As we shared our first dance as husband and wife, the world around us seemed to fade away. This was our moment, the culmination of everything we had been through, and the beginning of something even greater. The guests watched in awe, realizing that they had witnessed not just a wedding, but the start of a new legacy, one built on love, trust, and the kind of determination that only someone like Jack could possess. And as the night went on and we celebrated with our friends and family, I knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of our story. Together, Jack and I would face whatever challenges came our way, and we would do it hand in hand, as partners, as equals, and as soulmates. Our love story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun.